how it impacts the body, how the body responds to the particular condition or disease or even infection, and then how does one treat effectively for the individual. So, I mean, you're probably well aware that currently, in terms of anything that we treat, we look at the average person, and there are always going to be outliers. And that's often where the individual doesn't succeed in terms of successful treatments, or they have severe side effects. So it really is saying, like you were mentioning, Joanne, have the scan. This is what we need to give you based on your genetics. And there's another brilliant movie related to that, but we'll get to that just now. So really where it sits from a genetic perspective is the assumption is if we have the knowledge of the genetics around a disorder, a health event as such, we would have a means to know where to intercede, how to prevent, and how to effectively treat at the end of the day. So really the assumption is that there's going to be this transition in healthcare where currently we diagnose based on symptoms. A person is not feeling well, and ultimately it's a one size fits all, where we want to move to really how do we prevent and ultimately ensure that the person remains healthy and hopefully doesn't get sick. So Genetics 101, and I'm sure you all remember it pretty well, but again, our genetic information is really the code or the information that is stored in every single one of our cells, which when our body interprets the information that it holds, produces all the substances that make us look and function like we do. So some people call it their recipe, their blueprint, whatever terminology you'd like to use, but that is the essence of genetics. I know we tend to always think of, is it in the family? But the core role of genetics is me. How am I going to be? Where am I in my life stage? Unfortunately, as one ages, but it really does kind of affirm or confirm where we are. And structurally, our genetics is written in the code DNA, which again, I'm sure you're all well aware, but it's essentially 4 chemical base pairs or letters that are in a particular sequence that is then interpreted by the body and can produce various substances that we require. And that is really this picture on the right-hand side. The DNA holds the key. The DNA is translated into what we call RNA, which ultimately is translated into the sequence of amino acids that makes the protein. And as a total, we've got about 21,000 genes, and structurally, we've got about 46 chromosomes. So this is the basis of our genetics. And ultimately, in terms of genes, we assume we've always got 2 copies because we've always got 2 copies of a chromosome that contains the DNA information. So knowing that our genes produce substances, one thing we learned way back, and it was around about, I think it was 1865, there was a monk who figured out that his pea plants had different colored flowers based on who the parent plants were. And so at the time, there was this concept of a heritable element. And I mean, we call them genes now, but that was really the start of our understanding of genetics. And secondly, how genetics is passed from one generation to the next. Mm-hmm. And the key there was that in a gene usually has a particular, let's say, recipe, and that will produce a particular substance. But if there's any change to that recipe or the code itself, that's potentially going to impact what is produced by that gene. So the principle behind genetics and healthcare as a whole, and genetics and individual kind of response to diseases and disorders, is the variation in that genetic code. So in total, as humans, we've got about 3 billion letters. And the assumption is if we have a better handle on the impact of any variation to the code, which we think as the norm, we're going to learn more about a particular disease. And so early in the 90s, there was the launch of the Human Genome Project. And the principle behind it was to say, if we know how the entire genomes, in other words, all 3 billion letters of the DNA code make up all 23 pairs of chromosomes, what order that sequence should be. If we see any change, we're going to pick up firstly the genes that may be involved with the disease, and secondly, what changes in that gene results in the presentation of that condition. It took round about 10 years to decode our genome, and it cost millions of dollars at the end of the day. Nowadays, we can literally decode a genome in around about a week, and it costs you about $500. So that's have shifted.
When you say your genome, that's like I can go
all your letters
and get all my all 3 billion of my letters. I can go and figure out what that is in a week, you say?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah,
that's impressive.
So that's so that's called your whole genome sequencing. So moving back in terms of just the variation in code, we know that if there's any change in the structure of genetics, there's going to be a problem. And so I suppose our most common kind of like learning of a genetic change goes back to a higher level of the genetic structure, and that is looking at our chromosomes, which we know are kind of like the books that store the DNA code. And if we are formed with extra or a loss of a number of chromosomes, in other words, we don't have the perfect number of 46, there are going to be problems for that individual. But even losses or gains of part of a chromosome, and that's what this bottom picture is showing, leads to all forms of genetic disorders for that particular individual who started off at that point. So from birth, they have various conditions. But I'd like to actually focus on the DNA code. So really saying, what is a gene disorder? Because we know the DNA code is separated into unique sections, which are instructions for single items that our body requires. And that is what a gene is. And in essence, we've always thought of genetic disorders as rare. So we think of someone with hemophilia, like the bleeding disorder, or also known as the royal disease, because all the men in the royal family had hemophilia. Secondly, a very common one that I suppose presents itself that people can see is an individual with albinism, which again is based on a single gene. But in reality, there's really a continuum that a gene or multiple genes are actively involved in all forms of disease, and that the environment, regardless of whether it's a single gene disorder or what we call a multifactorial or polygenic disorder where multiple genes are involved, the environment plays a major role. But from a genetic perspective, we know that we can predict risk better based on if it's a single gene that needs to do something versus this complex interaction of genetics and environment at the same time. So when I speak of a gene disorder as such, it really goes back to this gene being the recipe. And this, I've just done kind of like a rudimentary little picture here. We've got 2 copies of the chromosome, and there's 2 copies of gene A. And this is gene A's code, and it produces this substance. That is our assumption. So when we speak of genetic disorder, what we're really saying is something has disrupted that code. And you can see there can be different changes. It literally can be one letter that changes. It can be a whole part of the gene that is either deleted or swapped around. But ultimately, that is called a variation in the code. Because remember, we know how it should read. If we see any variation, that could impact the function of the gene. In theory, what we also unfortunately learned is not all variation is disease causing. So we get variants that are pathogenic, disease causing. Some are just bad spelling, a bit like me without spell check. And then there's the third one, which we call uncertain. We actually still to this day don't know. And that is where we speak of one gene that can cause a particular disorder. We then moved away from just looking at a single gene associated with a genetic disorder like albinism, and we moved towards looking at the more complex disorders, because that's where the cost lies in terms of healthcare. If we think of diabetes, if we think of psychiatric disorders, we would want to know who is at risk so that earlier intervention may occur to reduce the impact of a particular condition. And so we started these studies or research which we call genome-wide association studies. The theory there being you have a group of people that have the condition, let's speak of diabetes, you have a group of people that don't, and you see across the entire genome, where do they vary? And depending on that variance, where do those variants occur? So which genes are involved, and is it significant between the two? Lots of issues around these types of studies. And one of the biggest issues is related to population genetics. So we assumed that all population groups will have a very similar reference code. We've learned now that that is not true. And so these genome-wide association studies were great in the West, because that's where most of the studies came from, and most of the individuals that were used for the Human Genome Project were basically white Europeans. And so the question is, what is the impact of trying to interpret this in other population groups? So we learned very quickly that you don't just pass it on. Each population group has got its own level of variation. And so you can't make huge assumptions in terms of variation of disease. But ultimately, what these research projects did is kind of like identify genes that may be involved in the disease development along the way, and maybe where treatment can be targeted. Here's a typical picture where on the left-hand side, you can see here in terms of obesity and like metabolic disorders, all these arrows are really showing the various genes that are involved in terms of the development of these metabolic disorders. And so the question is, well, where do we start? There's no one gene that switches on and off. There's this multiple picture. And likewise, what happens is you can get genes that are shared across different disorders. So you can have genes involved in metabolic disorders, like here on the left-hand side, as well as cancer. And so where do you prioritize, and what do you do? And I guess that has been the kind of process since the decoding of the human genome, is to try answer those questions. So we find these variants, but what does it mean in terms of disease development, and how do we use it effectively? And I think we get in there.
These pictures are, so complex. You can imagine that, being able to apply machine learning to this is going to be where, if, like a human brain will not be able to decipher the patterns and the commonalities between the two, code that is out of whack. We're not going to be able to do that, but the machine will be able to do that and learn and look for the patterns. And so is that happening more and more?
That is exactly what's happening. So I think, I'll get there now. I just want to, I think this is a good place to start, because how we initially did it, this PCR that you all know about, and I thought was very smart.
COVID PCRs, we've all heard of that.
You've all heard of that. But really all a PCR is making many copies of a particular region of the gene or the genetics, and so that we can read what the code says. And it's using the principle that our letters, our genetic DNA letters as such, have always got a partner. So if we want to identify the chemical base A, we need to input chemical base letter T, and they're almost like Velcro. They just kind of stick together. And that's how we really decode issues. And so PCR is essentially how that all started. We choose a part that we want to look at, and you can see there's two little arrows here, and we literally just make millions and millions of copies in between, and then we just read it by putting in certain dyes and looking at the letters. And here you can see in terms of, and we used to do this manually, where you'd look at the picture and see, is there any change in these nice little, what do you call them, peaks as such, that is going to show us that there's a change in the genetic code. And ultimately that is how we identified a variant. So it was tough work
by machines.
All machine learning. So now we use technology which we call next generation sequencing, which ultimately can do millions of PCRs at the same time. So instead of just a little portion of a gene, it can literally do your whole genome at the same time. So you've just got millions of PCRs happening at the same time. It spits out this massive code. That code then has a means, and there are many sequencing kind of algorithms to see, is the sequence change potentially disease causing or pathogenic or disruptive, I suppose, or is it just bad spelling? And so various algorithms have been put into play to ultimately allow for interpretation of any changes in the genes. And that is what has led us to the knowledge that we have now in terms of disease, in terms of disease progression in that. I just wanted to go back. Yeah, that's what we're really speaking of here, is this genome-wide association studies where we have to do the interpretation. We have got massive, large sample sizes. And what you can see is we can find many, many changes, but only a very small portion are relevant from a disease perspective. The rest of the time, it really is just the variability of the individual. And ironically, we're all about 99.8% the same. So it's that 0.02% that kind of like does it.
Makes all the difference.
To make us unique, indeed. And so here, even if you just look at from when we've been able to poke the genome, if I can put it that way, to figure out what's happening, we have learned a lot more. You can see the number of genes that have been identified and the conditions that they're being associated with. You can see the different type of technology. So here, exome sequencing, which is the active region of the genome, that is the kind of like the key testing option. Here you can see what the cost was to do a human genome. So here you can see it coming down and the time in terms of it to occur. So all of these are really just indicators of how technology has provided us with the kind of tools to understand better regarding conditions. These are all the various kind of, yeah.
And Noelene, so I mean, it's fascinating to me where things are going. You know, doctors being able to, you know, visit your doctor and have a problem that gets diagnosed, and you take medicine to fix the problem. That's going to be a thing of the past, in the not too distant future. Talk to me a little bit about what you see as the, you know, how you see this playing out in the health industry, how you see your average, you know, man on the street, what healthcare will look like for us. And we won't put a timeline on it, and we won't hold you to it, your predictions, but
I think to say that ultimately we would have our genetic code decoded, it will be interpreted, and one would be advised as to what to do to best manage your risk, and secondly, to best treat a condition. I mean, that ultimately is where we're going. And I suppose conditions that have not been completely easy to treat are becoming more treatable, and individuals are surviving more. And that is ultimately where you're going to go. So people speak of your health record and your genetic code that are going to come together. And I know time-wise, we don't have much time, but what I wanted to show you, so this is really just all the research, but there are things that are already in play based on our knowledge. So for example, even for an inherited condition like inherited cancer, there's treatment specific for individuals that have an inherited cancer condition. So their likelihood of survivorship is increased substantially just by virtue that they've already got a hereditary cancer risk, which for these families, often they were the ones on the sidelines because everyone was like, your risk is high, we don't really know what to do for you. So there's the shift there. In terms of cancer genetics, we can now look at the genetics of a tumor And the genetics of a tumor is kind of like the kind of profile of the tumor itself. And we can convert that into risk and whether a person should have chemotherapy or not and what their survival rate is like. And that's already available. We're also moving forward. Sorry, that's that's the puppy. We're also moving forward in terms of ultimately for even individuals that don't have a family history of cancer, that where do you sit in the general population in terms of cancer risk? And so they can kind of shift individuals into different categories. And so your screening will be different based on your risk profile. We've already got gene therapy for very specific genetic disorders. There's one for really early onset eye disorder. And there you're using a virus. We've all heard of the adenovirus. But here you actually use the virus to introduce a healthy gene, and that captures our body's way of copying a gene to produce a protein. And so that kind of replaces that which is missing because of the condition. Here we can actually trick the body into not reading the mutation in a gene, which also helps the young individuals. I was going to show you how this works, but it's really replacing the substance that is missing, and it stops the condition from presenting itself, so the individual has got a better outcome. We're also looking at microbiomes, so the genetics of all the bacteria hanging about with us, because that's very important. Also pharmacogenomics, who gets what and when, and there are all sorts of research and yeah, things. So you can see. Okay, so ultimately that's it. As you said, when it comes to all this data, and I really wanted to highlight that word data, because I think that from a tech perspective, this is where it's going to go crazy, because there's going to need to be that, where do you store the information? How do you use it? Like those kind of wearable devices that are going to manage your treatments. How is your doctor going to consult with you? Where's your screening going to come from? Where you're going to store your information? How are we going to continue learning more in terms of our genetics? And of course, then there are all the environmental and access factors, and across all of this, really the ethics and legal and socioeconomic kind of factors that come into play. So if you're worried that there's nothing to do, there's plenty. I think it's quite obvious. And I do think tech is going to be the very factor that's going to assist us, because it's just too much to kind of have in a book, or like me when I went to the library looking for a microfiche when it's all sitting on the computer. So yeah, I think that's
it's
important.
going to be an amazing combination of, you know, data science, really the field of data science and the field of genetics. I'm going to open it up to the floor. Does anyone have any questions for Noelene on what has been presented so far? And you guys can put it in the chat if you are too shy. Kwasi's asking, is it necessary to have a medical degree in order to do precision medicine or genetic counseling?
No, so, well, from a genetic counseling perspective, you would need basically a BSc or a BA. So either in social sciences or one of the sciences itself, and it's a master's degree. But there are opportunities all along the way. So if you're wanting to focus on care as such, so healthcare provider, you would be going more down the social sciences and the medical sciences. But there are also positions in terms of, I always think of here, looking at remote care data. So that would be someone who's involved with developing tech that can be used by individuals either with a condition or to kind of manage their condition. And
so like
already
an app,
they're phenomenal. There's a phenomenal diabetes app at the moment where you can input your sugar goodies. So, you know, I know we always kind of like look at the Apple Watch, but it's kind of where we're going. And for visually impaired individuals, there's phenomenal work in terms of glasses that can read for the individual and then read verbally into their ears. Although they can't see, they can hear what they're looking at. So I I suppose I'm very much in the clinical side, but I really do believe that there are so many technical opportunities sorry. Let me stop sharing because I see that my other colleagues are trying to get hold of me. So there's so many opportunities in terms of technology and where an individual can go and use technology as such. Not necessarily just the hard science of converting the genetics into information, but then how do you convert the information into a usable something? Even from a genetic counseling perspective, there are not many of us. And so one of the factors that we've looked at is can we use an app, for example, to take a family history that's already 20 minutes in our session? Or can we use an app, because a lot of what we do is provide information. So can we use an app to give you the basics that ultimately when you come through, we can focus on you as the individual and not kind of go through the generic information as
like handle questions and things like that.
Absolutely. Pertinent to the individual and not kind of like have to start here and kind of filter down to the story. So
exactly.
yeah.
I see whose question is this? So with a background of computer programming, you can probably land a role on the tech side. Is Kwasi's question / comment.
So Kwasi, I think that's a hard one to answer because in terms of clinical, the one whole section is what we call bioinformatics, which is converting the data into some or other information that the clinicians need to use. So many of the bioinformaticians that are not in research necessarily, but are in kind of diagnostics, are actively involved in clinical support. Because if you can remember, I said not every variation do we actually know what it does. And so we have to work together as a team to kind of come up with an answer for an individual. So, you know, when we speak of clinical, it's hard to kind of make those compartmentalize as such, but there are definitely opportunities for a tech individual on both the very heavy research just in the lab doing the testing to taking that story all the way through to working with clinicians and also thinking of product opportunities. There's also different tests that are marketed, put together based on needs out there. And I must say in South Africa, there's just a huge need from a technology perspective. Bioinformaticians are very scarce. And there are varying levels of individuals that can analyze this data. So it really is, you know, what do we need to do to make it most appropriate for them at the end of the day. So. And
Noelene, I mean, it seems like I love that last slide that you had that shows the different, essentially the opportunities that are in this industry. I mean, there's opportunities around creating apps and devices that are going to help us. There's opportunities around better analyzing the data and making sense of it, making sense of our code to be able to figure out solutions and prevent problems. And then there's also, you know, the general sort of health side where we're going to hopefully be able to do something with this information that we're coming up with. I guess your field is more on the health side, but if you look at the overall sector and all the different skills that are going to be needed to sort of bring these opportunities to life, what would you tell a young person, you know, sitting in high school? What are some of the skills that they should be focusing on now and thinking about for university or for tertiary education that is going to help them sort of tap into this industry if it's something that they want?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it's very big.
I guess it, and I don't have a list. I guess from the clinical perspective, I think with all of it, science, and I don't know what the topics are called anymore, so life sciences, natural sciences, definitely any form of technology. So I often feel I'm on the back foot because as mentioned, when I was at varsity, there wasn't even internet. So there's certain factors that definitely I think would play a huge role, just in terms of programming, in terms of app development, in terms of even being creative as to how does one communicate this very technical information. You know, we always kind of like look at it as numbers, but there's a skill to kind of present it. And we haven't even started looking at like environmental and lifestyle factors, where even there, it doesn't necessarily need to be the science again, but how does one get involved with maybe helping individuals change their lifestyle, wellness coaches, which again, I guess I'm really not answering the question, but I do think it is about the sciences, but definitely about a good knowledge of technology, how to interpret data. So the use of algorithms, development of algorithms, or even just knowing how to input, I suppose, calculations, so that one can come to a point of a particular question. I suppose macros on Excel, which I guess is old school.
Yeah, but at a high school level,
really
that's math.
So there you go. So macros and that kind of, because it's all about filtering the data into a usable and kind of like information that one can assimilate. And I often say, and I'm proving the point here, if you don't really know your subject, you're not going to be able to communicate it. And having a handle on data and how one can present it is a huge, I think, a huge missing kind of skill, where I do feel anyone who is at school at the moment probably is in a far better place, because one is accustomed to using tech or tools that is continuously filtering data. So yeah, not a direct answer. I do apologize, but I hope it gives some context.
That's super helpful. I mean, what I'm hearing is that you know, there's a need for maths, the sort of data statistics side of maths that's going to help you potentially in this field. There's definitely, if you're wanting to go into the clinical side, the sciences are going to help you. And I mean, I know that learners get exposed to Excel at high school already, but at a sort of basic level. And so being able to understand and use Excel and use it to be able to visualize data is a very, very valuable skill that I'm hearing from you. So let me just ask, I see we're almost out of time, so let me open it up once more to see, do you guys have any other questions? I see I've got Ronewa, Lebogang, Mila, sorry. Do you guys have any questions for Noelene? Any comments? Are you guys excited about maybe going into genetics one day? I'm hearing silence. Crickets.
Maybe it's great excitement, but yeah, everyone's stunned. So I hope, yeah. I do think it is a massively growing field, but it's hard to kind of see where one wants to go, particularly right at the very beginning. But I also feel once you start going down a particular course, I think you'll find your groove, really. And it's either going to be very medical or very technical, or a combo of both. So.
Yeah, that's what's exciting. I mean, there's so many new things coming in this field that really there is no set pathway.
No.
But it looks like there's lots and lots of opportunity coming up. I just wanted to thank you so much, Noelene, for your time and giving us an insight into this world that's coming. Well, actually, no, this world that's here already. we just aren't all aware of it because genetic counseling is still very expensive. How much does it cost to do a genetic counseling
consult?
visit?
It's 1,350 Rand for a consult, which is usually about an hour. It's covered by medical aids. And if people are in the state system, they also can be referred to genetic counselors. So
okay, that's not so expensive. I thought it was a lot more than that.
No, it's the testing. The testing is expensive. So a genetic test, and I'm speaking for single gene disorders, can range anywhere from about 5,000 to about 20,000 Rand. We don't do all the testing in South Africa, so that's why we need more techies, so that we can make it a little bit cheaper. But overseas, the cost is also quite great.
And that's if you're wanting to test specifically for cancer, like
a genetic condition,
kind
yes,
of cancer.
Kwasi,
do you have another question? Sorry, I'm seeing your hand up.
Hello everyone.
Hi,
Kwasi.
Yes, I have a question. Sorry, I was in a very close space. I was in the library, so I had to step out just so I can ask this one directly. I'm currently in an engineering field, and I must say I'm very intrigued from your presentation. Truth be told, I've always had a thing that I have with medicine. So now having or hearing about the genetic counseling and precision medicine, I'm just in a way finding a thing that is might land me a step into the medical
field. Absolutely.
So my question particularly right now is, what are some of the challenges that you had in your journey? Because I realized that your journey was sort of not straightforward. In a way, you went to work and then you had to stop working and then go back to school so that you can follow this route. I just would like to ask, what were some of the challenges that you had or just that you faced and that you think were in a way necessary and that are helping you like now?
No. Thanks for that, Kwasi. I think the challenges were I had to catch up on the science. That was really probably one of my most difficult parts, the science and the technology. So although I understood Excel and Word, that's about as far as it went. And also just learning to filter information. So it's data again, but there is just so much research, and research even has a hierarchy. And you can find a fabulous article, but it's rubbish. And so it's that skill was something that I really needed to put to use, because I was overwhelmed with the amount of information and I felt I had to read it all and assimilate it all. But they're clever ways of doing it. And that was one of the big keys. Again, using the people around me. So I really just spoke to anyone that would listen to me and answer my questions. And people often have fabulous little quirky ways of dealing with things. So that helped me in my journey. And then a lot of it just came down to, as soon as I got into the practice, it felt right. So yes, I wasn't perfect. I was still learning, but it was such an encouragement to continue, because for the first time, the science that I love, I mean, I've always thought genetic fascinating, was brought into a space that could be used for individuals and families. And it wasn't, again, just for like a percentage of South African communities, but actually I was working in state, and the state had a far stronger clinical genetics, exposure than in private. And that was definitely huge for me. It was huge because of communication across culture, across language barriers. I had a lot of learning to do. And remember, I did my undergrad before 1994, so that also gives you a bit of context of my upbringing. So it was phenomenal. But I do think if you're interested, it's hard. It's a hard degree because you're working and you're researching and you're writing basically a paper.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's worth
And
it.
more especially, it's a master's.
And we
degree
need
then
more
to
men.
attain.
Indeed.
Oh, really?
Yes, we do. We
Okay.
want lots of male genetic counselors. So yeah.
That's good.
Thank you so much, Noelene.
Thanks, Kwasi. Thanks for
you,
your question.
Kwasi.
Noelene, thank you so much for your time. And I think we're going to make this recording available. And, if anyone does have any other questions, you guys are welcome to email us at info@TechWays.Online. And we can always, loop Noelene in if there's something specific that you're wanting to know about, like what do I need to do to get into this degree or something like that. You're welcome to drop us specific questions directly, but it's been lovely having you online and learning more about this,
Thank you.
Where the world is going. And I hope I get to see that sci-fi movie. What was the sci-fi movie that you were talking about? Because I'm going to watch it.
I can't think of the name.
Oh no.
I'm going to have to post it.
Please
It's just
send
gone.
us the name. We'll check it out later.
I will.
Yeah,
because it starts off with two brothers and their genetic code. Oh.
Okay, well, we'll wait
brilliant.
to hear. But I
think it's where we're going. Yeah,
I love seeing where sci-fi is becoming reality. So thanks so much for sharing, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Jan. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.